In the quiet dawn of a Virginia plantation, a child was born not into love, but into bondage. His first breath was not a cause for celebration, but for calculation. To the overseer, he was not a son. He was a future profit and investment in human flesh. This was the world of America's breeding farms. Vast, brutal enterprises where black bodies were cultivated, not just to work but to reproduce. Between the tobacco fields of Maryland and the cotton-rich soil of Virginia, a monstrous economy flourished in the shadows. Here, enslaved women were not just laborers, they were breeders. Their value was tied not to their strength in the field, but to their fertility, to the number of children they could produce. Children who were torn from their arms and sold off like livestock. Imagine being 13 and knowing that your worth would soon be measured by how quickly you could conceive. Imagine being forced to mate with someone you did not know, while white men watched and kept records. This was not a rare occurrence. It was policy, it was profit, and it was routine. These breeding farms were not rogue operations, they were part of a calculated system that rose to power after 1808, when the U.S. officially ended the importation of slaves from Africa. But the demand for enslaved labor did not stop, so the South turned inward. Enslaved people were forced to reproduce to supply the growing plantations with more workers. The womb became a battlefield. Reproduction became a business. There were no wedding vows, no protection, no consent, just pairings and punishments, pregnancies and profits. If a woman did not produce children quickly enough, she could be beaten, sold, or simply replaced. Some were subjected to multiple rapes a week. Their bodies became assembly lines for the Southern economy. And yet, this chapter of American history remains shrouded in silence, absent from textbooks, omitted from classroom discussions, buried under myths of a genteel South. But the truth still echoes in the bloodlines of millions, in the trauma passed down, in the names lost and never recorded. This is not just a story of horror, it is a story of survival, of women who endured the unimaginable, of men who resisted the dehumanization, and of a nation that built its prosperity on the bodies of those it refused to see as human. Welcome to the hidden history of America's breeding farms. In the heart of Richmond, Virginia, once the bustling capital of the Confederacy, stood a building so grim its name still echoes with dread. Lumpkin's Jail. Though little remains of it today, beneath the foundations of modern city blocks and polished glass towers, history still breathes deep, dark, and unrelenting. But Lumpkin's Jail was more than just a prison. It was the engine room of America's domestic slave trade, a holding pen not only for those awaiting auction, but for those condemned to the cruelest corners of the slave economy, breeding and breaking. Picture this: a two-story brick structure crouched along the banks of Shockoe Creek, its windows barred, its basement damp with mold and misery. Below ground, there were cramped, lightless cells where dozens of enslaved men, women, and even children were kept in chains, their bodies bearing the marks of punishment and forced submission. It was here that many waited, some for days, others for weeks, to be sold off to far-flung plantations in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. Others were detained for training, a term that glossed over the brutal beatings used to instill obedience and crush the will to escape. Robert Lumpkin, the man behind this operation, was no mere jailer. He was a businessman, one who understood the value of human flesh and knew how to manipulate a system built on greed. With the end of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, the Southern economy turned inward. No longer able to import slaves, they began to breed them. Lumpkin's Jail was a key node in this system. Enslaved women were frequently held here after being forcibly separated from their families. Their physical attributes, particularly their fertility, were meticulously documented. If a woman had previously borne several children, her value increased. Some were raped by slave traders or paired with other enslaved men solely for reproductive purposes. There was no choice, no consent, no protection from repeated violation. Imagine standing in that basement, your hands bound, knowing your body would be used not just for labor but for reproduction. That every child you bore would be taken from you and sold like livestock. And that any resistance, refusal to comply, attempt to run, failure to produce children might earn you a public beating or solitary confinement in the darkest corners of the jail. The brick walls of Lumpkins echoed with screams muffled by fear and hopelessness. To walk those halls was to witness human dignity stripped bare. And yet, perhaps the most chilling part of Lumpkins jail was its proximity to everyday life. Just steps, white Richmonders strolled the streets, visited the nearby markets, drank at taverns, or worshipped at churches, often fully aware of what happened within those walls. Some even came to Lumpkins to browse the stock, inspecting teeth, checking muscle tone, lifting skirts to assess a woman's hips, all in preparation for purchase. Lumpkin even provided lodging for buyers. His own home atop the jail included quarters for visiting traders, an added convenience in the commodification of human life. In a grotesque twist, Robert Lumpkin also lived in this same building with a formerly enslaved black woman named Mary and their mixed-race children. It is said that he freed her, though the power dynamics and trauma of such a relationship render that word meaningless. Their children played on the same ground where others were shackled. Upstairs, Lumpkin's family ate dinner. Downstairs, other women carried his children without choice, without voice, without name. But the story does not end there. After Lumpkin's death and the Confederacy's defeat, Mary Lumpkin made an extraordinary decision. She inherited the property and, rather than sell or destroy it, she leased the space to a Northern Baptist minister. In a building that once symbolized unimaginable cruelty, a school was established for newly freed African Americans. That school would become the foundation for Virginia Union University, a beacon of black education in the very place where black people were once broken. From the pit of despair grew the roots of liberation. Lumpkin's jail is rarely mentioned in textbooks, seldom discussed in classrooms, and almost never recognized in popular media. But its legacy is undeniable. It stands as a visceral reminder of how slavery was not just a Southern tradition or a historical misstep, but a carefully constructed and ruthlessly maintained system of profit, power, and dehumanization. Every brick in Lumpkin's walls was laid with intention, every scream muffled by indifference, every transaction justified by a belief in white supremacy and economic entitlement. And now, as we walk through Richmond's cobbled streets or visit memorials that only partially tell the story, we must remember what stood here. We must remember the women forced to give birth for profit, the men beaten into submission, the children sold before they could speak. We must remember that America's wealth, its institutions, its cities, its systems were built not just on stolen labor, but on stolen lives, on mothers who were never allowed to mother, on fathers who were never allowed to protect, on families destroyed by the scratch of a pen and the bang of an auctioneer's gavel. Lumpkin's jail is no longer visible, but it is not gone. It survives in the trauma carried through generations, in the silences of our textbooks, and in the ghosts of a nation still reckoning with its past. And as we listen to those echoes, let us not turn away. Let us not soften the truth. Let us name it, know it, and carry it forward so that what happened in the dark heart of Richmond is never forgotten again. They called it progress, a sleek, hand-cranked machine with rotating wire teeth and brushes. A device so simple in appearance it could fit atop a table. In 1793, Ellie Whitney unveiled the cotton gin, short for engine, with the hope of solving a pressing agricultural problem. At the time, cotton was a labor-intensive crop, especially the short staple variety that grew prolifically in the southern interior. Its stubborn seeds clung tightly to the cotton fibers, and it could take an enslaved person a full day to clean a single pound by hand. Whitney, a young Yale graduate seeking opportunity in the South, saw a mechanical solution. What he did not foresee, or perhaps did not care to acknowledge, was that his invention would not liberate laborers. It would enslave more. The cotton gin could clean 50 pounds of cotton in the time it took a person to clean one. A marvel of industrial ingenuity. Yes, but for the American South, it was something far more powerful, a license to expand. With this machine, what was once unprofitable land in the interior could now be transformed into a sprawling sea of cotton fields. In the years that followed, cotton ceased being just a crop. It became a kingdom. King Cotton, they called it, and the throne was built on human backs. The logic was as brutal as it was efficient. If a machine could clean more cotton, then planters could grow more of it, and to plant, cultivate, and harvest that much cotton, they would need more labor, not less. And because the transatlantic slave trade had been banned in 1808, enslavers turned inward. The bodies needed to pick the cotton would now be bred, bartered, and sold from within. The demand for enslaved people skyrocketed, and with it, the horrors of breeding farms and human auctions reached new depths. Cotton was no longer just an agricultural product. It was an empire, and the cotton gin was its sword. Imagine standing on a plantation in Mississippi in 1835. The fields stretch as far as the eye can see, glistening white in the sun, like snow that burns to the touch. The rows are endless. The work begins before sunrise and continues until darkness cloaks the land. Children, too small to carry full sacks, still work alongside their mothers. The overseer rides his horse up and down the rows, whip at the ready. The gin, housed in a nearby shed, hums with relentless rhythm. For every pound of cotton picked, the demand grows stronger, and with every bale shipped north or across the Atlantic to English textile mills, the Southern economy grows fat, while the enslaved grow thin. Whitney's invention may have revolutionized agriculture, but its most significant impact was not on crops, it was on people. It tied black bodies more tightly to the Southern economy than ever before. The enslaved were no longer just laborers. They were the fuel for an industrial revolution that, ironically, claimed to value freedom and progress. Their labor lined the pockets of planters, built fortunes in northern banks, and powered the rise of American capitalism. Frederick Douglass, who had been enslaved in Maryland, later reflected on this bitter truth: the white man's power to enslave the black man. He wrote, grew out of the very progress of the nation. Whitney's cotton gin was not a tool of liberation. It was a machine of captivity. And what made it even more sinister was how deeply embedded it became in American life. Cotton financed universities, church missions, railroad lines, and shipping companies. Its profits built mansions and endowed libraries. And all the while, the people who picked it, who bled for it, were considered property, not partners in progress. There were whispers among enslaved communities about the machine that changed everything. Some had seen it. Others only knew its effects. The more we picked, the more they wanted, one woman reportedly said decades later. And the more they wanted, the more they beat us. The cotton gin made productivity measurable. A good picker might gather 200 pounds a day. If someone picked less, punishment often followed. Incentives were replaced with quotas, and failure to meet them meant more than lost wages, it meant scars. As cotton spread across the South like wildfire, so did the brutal tactics used to control those forced to harvest it. Fields in Alabama and Mississippi became the front lines of silent wars, wars of resistance, endurance, and sheer will. Families were torn apart to populate new plantations. Slave traders followed the cotton routes, their coffles of chained people marching across dusty roads, bound for yet another harvest. The cotton gin had made slavery not just sustainable but wildly profitable. even when Northern abolitionists began to raise their voices. The grip of cotton tightened. Britain, the world's textile powerhouse, relied heavily on American cotton. When the Civil War loomed, Southern leaders believed their cotton exports gave them international leverage. Henry Hammond of South Carolina once proclaimed to Congress, "Without firing a gun, without drawing a sword, we could bring the whole world to our feet. All it would take," he suggested, was to stop the flow of cotton. Cotton diplomacy, they called it, a belief that this crop, and the labor that sustained it, made the South untouchable. But the very strength of cotton became its weakness. The Union, understanding its importance, blockaded ports and cut off supply lines. Enslaved people, too, saw an opportunity. As Union armies marched deeper into Confederate territory, thousands fled plantations, some to join the fight, others to simply breathe free air. The same cotton fields that once imprisoned them became the very battlegrounds for their liberation. Today, the legacy of the cotton gin is rarely questioned. It is taught as an invention of genius, a turning point in American innovation. And in terms of mechanics, it was. But to ignore its cost is to ignore the millions who lived, labored, and died under its shadow. The cotton gin did not invent slavery, but it supercharged it. It industrialized it. It transformed human beings into components of a supply chain. And yet, through it all, the enslaved resisted in song, in silence, in escape, in survival. Their strength was not forged by machines, but by memory, hope, and the unyielding belief that they were more than what society claimed them to be. In every strand of cotton woven into the fabric of American prosperity lies a story of pain and perseverance. The cotton gin, a tool meant to ease labor, instead deepened bondage. But those who bore its burden refused to be forgotten. Their legacy is stitched into every thread. They called it white gold, not for its color, but for the empire it built. Cotton, soft to the touch and deadly in its legacy, became the economic engine of the American South, a prop so profitable, so deeply woven into the global economy, that slavery itself became indispensable to its cultivation. This was not a coincidence. It was design, a system so vast and so calculating that by the mid-19th century, every thread of Southern society, its politics, its wealth, its culture was tied to the cotton fields and the people who were forced to work them. Long before skyscrapers rose and Wall Street became a symbol of power, the cotton fields of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana were churning out wealth that rivaled the gold mines of any empire. But that wealth did not grow from the ground alone. It was extracted through the relentless labor of enslaved people, driven by whips, confined by laws, and sold like cattle. The South's soil may have been fertile, but it was the backs of the enslaved that truly carried the weight of its prosperity. This was no side business. By the 1850s, the American South was producing more than 75% of the world's cotton. That cotton did not just stay within U.S. borders. It fed the hungry looms of Manchester and Liverpool in England, supplied the textile mills of New England, and clothed entire continents. But behind every bale of cotton was a person, someone who had picked under the blazing sun, fingers bloodied by the burrs, shoulders aching, eyes scanning for the overseer's shadow. And yet, for planters and financiers, cotton was merely a commodity. The people who picked it were counted only in ledgers, their value calculated not by humanity but by productivity. Slavery had existed long before cotton reigned supreme, but cotton gave slavery a new life, a new agency. It made the institution profitable beyond imagination. A single healthy enslaved man, strong enough to pick hundreds of pounds a day, could sell for the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars today. Families were torn apart to supply that demand. Breeding farms sprang up in Virginia and Maryland, supplying fresh stock for the ever-expanding plantations in the Deep South. And with the cotton gin's invention, which multiplied productivity overnight, the hunger for labor grew insatiable. Economists in the North, politicians in Washington, and merchants in Europe all had a stake in this machinery. Banks offered loans with enslaved people as collateral. Insurance companies wrote policies to protect planters against loss of property. Ships carrying cotton also carried shackles, and ports that welcomed southern cargo turned blind eyes to the suffering it represented. Even northern industries that would later claim moral superiority were built, in part, on profits drawn from cotton and by extension, from slavery itself. Henry Clay, a leading statesman of the time, once said, "The South cannot live without slavery," and in many ways, he was right, not because the South lacked alternative ways to build an economy, but because it had become addicted to the easy profits that slavery delivered. Cotton was not just a crop, it was a justification, a reason to continue separating children from mothers, a reason to whip a man until he could barely stand, a reason to write laws that defined people as property. The economics made it logical, cold, rational, but never human. Consider the sprawling plantations of Natchez, Mississippi, once home to more millionaires per capita than any other American city. These grand estates, with their white columns and endless porches, were not built by the hands of their owners. They were built by those who could not leave, who could not rest, who could not refuse. The architecture of the South, the wealth, the culture, the supposed grace was propped up by human suffering, polished over by the illusion of civility. And within this system, everything had a price. A skilled carpenter, worth more. A woman of childbearing age, often more valuable than a man, not for her labor, but for her womb. Children, commodities in waiting. The most chilling part of this economy was not its brutality but its normalization. The sale of humans was not hidden, it was advertised. In newspapers, on courthouse steps, with bidding wars and contracts and receipts. But the enslaved knew the truth behind the numbers. They knew that white gold was stained red. They felt it in their scars, in the weight of the sacks they carried, in the absence of their loved ones sold down river. Still, amid the brutality, they resisted. Quietly, defiantly, in songs hummed under breath, in stories whispered at night, in work slowed just enough to matter, in escapes plotted across seasons. And sometimes, even in open rebellion. The economics of slavery were a well-oiled machine but not an unchallenged one. Abolitionists in the North began to raise their voices. Enslaved people fled or fought or found ways to survive without surrendering their humanity. And when the Civil War finally arrived, the South's belief in cotton's invincibility began to crumble. Union forces targeted cotton supplies. Enslaved people abandoned the fields, weakening the labor force from within. The very foundation that had made slavery seem untouchable began to shift under its own weight. Yet even after the Emancipation Proclamation and the war's end, the legacy of cotton endured. Sharecropping replaced slavery in name but not in function. The plantations remained, the poverty persisted, and the economic disparities set in motion by white gold continued to echo across generations. Today, we wear cotton like second skin, often without thought. It is in our clothes, our bedsheets, our history. But woven into those fibers are stories of forced labor, of broken families, of a system that valued profit over people. The South's wealth may have once gleamed in its cotton fields, but that shine was bought at a terrible cost. To understand slavery is to understand more than chains and auctions. It is to see the machinery behind it, the economy that turned human beings into assets, the markets that assigned value to black lives not in moral worth, but in dollars and cents, and the millions who, despite everything, refused to be defined by a ledger. They were not just the backbone of the cotton empire. They were its conscience, and their memory will outlast every plantation wall and every bale of white gold ever grown. They bore the heaviest burdens in silence, bodies bent under the weight of labor, spirits strained by the heartbreak of separation, and minds haunted by a system that saw them not as women, but as tools. Enslaved women in the American South lived at the cruel crossroads of physical toil and psychological torment. Their role in the machinery of slavery was unique, complex, and devastating. They were field hands, domestic workers, caregivers, mothers, and most horrifically victims of systemic sexual exploitation. In a society that commodified human beings, enslaved women were among the most ruthlessly objectified. In the cotton fields, women worked side by side with men from dawn until dusk. There was no special consideration for gender. They bent over rows of cotton plants, their fingers bloodied by thorns, their backs aching from the weight of sacks that grew heavier with each hour. They gave birth, nursed their infants under trees, and returned to the rows before their bodies had time to heal. There were no maternity breaks, no gentle treatment. The overseer's whip made no distinction between a man's muscles and a woman's endurance. Cotton had to be picked, and pain was simply part of the equation. But the fields were only part of their story. Inside the plantation homes, enslaved women took on the invisible labor that sustained the white household as illusion of gentility. They cooked meals they were not allowed to eat. They sewed fine clothes they could never wear. They nursed white children, even while their own went hungry or were taken from them. Some served as housekeepers, personal attendants, or wet nurses, roles that kept them in close proximity to their enslavers and made them even more vulnerable. This proximity often came at a terrible price. Sexual violence was an unspoken yet pervasive element of slavery. Enslaved women had no legal right to refuse advances, no protection under the law, no recourse. Their bodies were not their own, they were the property of others, to be used, sold, or abused as seen fit. Slaveholders often justified their actions through grotesque reasoning, claiming affection or inevitability. But the truth was simple: it was exploitation, codified and protected by a system that refused to see enslaved women as human. Many were assaulted repeatedly. Others were paired with enslaved men in forced breeding arrangements designed to increase the enslaver's stock. Their pregnancies were not seen as the beginnings of families, but as investments, new bodies to labor in the fields or be sold at auction. The children born from these violations were often mixed race and bore the features of the men who owned their mothers. On some plantations, it was not uncommon to see white enslavers surrounded by children who resembled them, a grotesque and public secret that no one dared to name. The trauma of this reality extended far beyond the physical. For enslaved women, motherhood itself became a fragile, painful endeavor. A baby's cry was not just a symbol of new life, it was a countdown. At any moment, that child could be sold, traded, or sent away, never to be seen again. Mothers lived with the daily terror of loss, knowing that love could not protect their children from the market's demands. And when separation came, as it often did, it left wounds no auction block could measure. Harriet Jacobs, one of the few formerly enslaved women to leave behind a written account of her life, described in painful detail how she hid in a crawl space for 7 years to escape the advances of her enslaver and remain close to her children. Her words pierced through time, revealing the impossible choices faced by so many: endure abuse or risk death for a chance at dignity. Her story was not the exception, it was the unspoken reality of countless women who suffered quietly, invisibly. Even in bondage, enslaved women found ways to resist, not always through rebellion, but through survival. They preserved oral traditions, passed down ancestral knowledge, and created tight-knit communities within the confines of the plantation. They sang songs that carried coded messages. They stitched patterns into quilts that could guide runaways to freedom. They clung to memory, identity, and hope in a world determined to erase them. Religion, too, became both a sanctuary and a battlefield. While white enslavers often used distorted biblical verses to justify slavery, enslaved women interpreted those same scriptures as messages of liberation. They found strength in the stories of Hagar, the outcast mother, or of Miriam, who led her people in song. Spirituals like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot were not just songs, they were prayers, messages, and defiant declarations that they had not given up. And when freedom finally came imperfect, delayed, and incomplete, it was often the women who held communities together. They searched for lost children. They rebuilt homes. They joined churches, founded schools, and led quiet revolutions in kitchens and classrooms. They carried with them the stories of what had been done and what had been endured, ensuring that the truth of their suffering would not be forgotten in the myth-making of the New South. In telling the story of American slavery, it is not enough to talk about labor and politics. We must talk about the women, the mothers, who were not allowed to mother, the daughters who were never protected, the wives who were separated from their husbands with a single stroke of ink. Their scars, both visible and hidden, are part of the legacy that built this nation. And to overlook them is to overlook the heart of the cruelty and the strength that survived it. They were not passive victims. They were survivors, creators, protectors, and teachers. And though the system sought to break them, many found ways to hold on not just to life, but to meaning. In their stories, we do not find only suffering. We find resistance. We find humanity. And we find the unshakable truth that even in the darkest soil, something sacred can grow. They called them property, but property does not sing at night. Property does not whisper escape rotes in the hush of darkened cabins. Property does not kneel in cotton fields and pray for freedom with eyes wide open to the stars. For all the tools of terror that the institution of slavery wielded, whips, chains, breeding farms, auction blocks, one thing it could never fully extinguish was the spirit of resistance. Enslaved people resisted not because they thought they would win, but because refusing to resist meant accepting a lie, that they were less than human. And so they fought, sometimes with fists, sometimes with fire, sometimes with nothing but a song. The very existence of rebellion during slavery is itself a testimony to courage. Open revolts were rare, but not because of submission. They were rare because the consequences were horrific. Slaves caught planning insurrections were mutilated, tortured, or executed publicly to send a message. Still, resistance flared like sparks in dry brush. There was Nat Turner, who in 1831 led a rebellion in Virginia that left over 50 white people dead before he was captured and hanged. His uprising was fueled by visions, a belief that he was chosen by God to strike at the system's heart. Though the rebellion was crushed, it sent waves of terror through the South, prompting harsher laws and deeper paranoia among slaveholders. But rebellion was not always loud. Sometimes it came in the form of broken tools, work slow to a crawl, crops ruined by accident. Sometimes it was simply refusing to show fear, a sideways glance, a held st, a silence that spoke volumes. Enslaved people learned to carve out small spaces of control in a world that offered them none. These quiet acts of resistance were not dramatic, but they were powerful. They said, "You may own my labor, but not my mind." Nowhere did resistance become more symbolically potent than in the spiritual songs sung in the fields, in cabins, and in secret gatherings. To an overseer, they might have seemed harmless religious expressions from a people too broken to fight. But hidden in the melodies were messages. Weed in the water, for instance, urged runaways to enter streams to throw off the dogs tracking their scent. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot was a coded anthem of longing for freedom. With home not in heaven, but in the north, these songs were maps, resistance manuals disguised as hymns. They were community, memory, and prayer stitched together in rhythm. The Underground Railroad was another form of organized defiance, a vast and intricate web of safe houses, secret codes, and fearless conductors who guided runaways north. It was neither underground nor a railroad, but it was both secret and methodical. Stations were homes or churches. Conductors were free blacks, white abolitionists, or formerly enslaved people who risked everything to guide others to freedom. Harriet Tubman, herself once enslaved, became its most iconic figure. She returned to the South at least 13 times, rescuing over 70 people. Always armed, always resolute, her name became legend. Her courage a defiance that echoed louder than any whip crack. But not all journeys were external. Some acts of survival were internal voyages resisting despair. Protecting identity. Remembering home. On plantations, enslaved Africans and their descendants created new languages, blended spiritual traditions, and held on to cultural practices that slavery tried to erase. The Gullah and Geechee people, for example, preserved African linguistic roots and customs on the sea islands of South Carolina and Georgia. Their very existence defied the erasure that slavery intended. Even motherhood became an act of resistance. In a system designed to commodify life, enslaved women passed down names, stories, and ancestral wisdom. They stitched quilts with coded messages. They taught their children songs that remembered where they came from and hinted where they could go. In their lullabies were maps, and in their stories, lessons of caution and courage. Sometimes, resistance meant reclaiming the right to grieve. When families were torn apart at the auction block, enslaved people gathered in secret to mourn and pray. They held makeshift funerals when someone died. Even when denied a grave marker, they carved memory into songs, into trees, into each other. To remember was to resist. There were also those who resisted with ink and voice. Frederick Douglass, born into slavery, escaped to the North and wrote his own story, an act both revolutionary and dangerous. Harriet Jacobs, another escapee, exposed the sexual violence inflicted upon enslaved women in her autobiography Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, one of the first of its kind. Their words burned through the genteel lies of Southern apologists and gave voice to millions who had been silenced. And resistance lived even in death. Some enslaved people chose suicide rather than continued bondage. Others poisoned their enslavers, acts of quiet vengeance. There were stories of conjure women healers and herbalists who used their knowledge of roots and medicine to aid in resistance, protect their communities, or exact revenge. The Civil War did not begin as a war to end slavery, but as it raged, the enslaved took matters into their own hands. Thousands fled to Union lines, turning war camps into places of liberation. Some fought for the North. Others simply walked away from the fields and never returned. Their defiance reshaped the war itself. Abraham Lincoln would later admit that without the self-emancipating efforts of enslaved people, victory might not have been possible. Slavery tried to make resistance seem futile, but every time a person survived, remembered, sang, ran, or refused to be broken, they chipped away at that lie. They were not passive recipients of cruelty, they were agents of their own survival. And though the system told them they were voiceless, their defiance became a chorus that would echo across centuries. So when we speak of resistance under slavery, we must expand our vision. It was not just revolts and runaways. It was the mother who braided messages into her daughter's hair. It was the preacher who twisted a Bible verse into a subversive sermon. It was the young man who learned to read in secret, and the elder who remembered a language no overseer could understand. It was every whispered plan, every hidden footstep, every ember of rebellion nurtured beneath the ashes of oppression. These stories matter not because they ended slavery, but because they preserve dignity within it. They remind us that even in the darkest systems, light can survive, not as a flood but as a spark that passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, until one day it caught fire. They tried to break the bodies, but the spirit refused to yield. Beneath the crushing weight of chains, toil, and terror, enslaved Africans in America reached back across an ocean to hold on to the invisible threads of home. And in that reach, they wove something entirely new. Culture did not merely survive in the slave quarters, it flourished, whispered through stories, sung through sorrow, and etched into every ritual that defied the silence imposed by bondage. This was not just resilience, it was resistance. And nowhere was this more powerful than in the birth of the Gullah Geechee culture and the spiritual world it preserved. Along the coastal lowlands of South Carolina, Georgia, and the sea islands that drift like forgotten memories along the Atlantic shore, something remarkable happened. Isolated by geography and ignored by slaveholders who saw them as tools rather than thinkers, the enslaved Africans of this region retained more of their ancestral heritage than anywhere else in the United States. These communities became the cradle of the Gullah Geechee people, descendants of various African ethnic groups who forged a new identity under fire. They spoke a Creole language that danced between English and the rhythms of West African tongues, a living echo of the villages they were stolen from. But language was only the beginning. Their spiritual beliefs, agricultural knowledge, foodways, music, and oral traditions created a culture that was both a refuge and a declaration. We are still here. In the hush of night, by the flicker of firelight, stories were told, folk tales about clever animals and wise ancestors that offered lessons in survival and morality. These were not just tales to amuse children. They were coded messages, reminders of identity, and sometimes maps for navigating a brutal world. The trickster figure Brer Rabbit, derived from Anansi the spider and other African lore, was the enslaved person's avatar, small but smart, outwitting the stronger oppressor. These stories reminded the listeners that strength did not always lie in muscle, and that even in powerlessness, cleverness could be a form of power. Religion, too, became a shelter built from two worlds. Enslavers brought Christianity with them, often weaponizing it with verses demanding obedience. But enslaved Africans reshaped the faith, fusing it with their own spiritual traditions. What emerged was not submission, it was transformation. The result was a uniquely African-American spirituality that saw God not only in the Bible, but in rivers, trees, ancestors, and dreams. Church became sanctuary. It was where enslaved people could mourn, hope, and organize. But it was also where African rhythms returned, disguised as clapping, stomping, and call and response hymns. When voices rose in spirituals like Steal Away or Go Down, Moses, they were not just praying for deliverance, they were recalling Exodus, mapping freedom, and reasserting their divine worth in a world that tried to deny it. Even death did not end their connection to home. The Gullah Geechee people, in particular, held on to beliefs about spirits, ancestors, and the afterlife that closely resembled West African cosmology. Graveyards were decorated with offering shells, pottery, broken plates meant to honor the dead and guide them in the spirit world. These practices were rarely understood or respected by outsiders, but they served as an unbroken thread to the past, a quiet proclamation that they had not forgotten who they were. Their music was another kind of memory. Spirituals, work songs, and ring shouts, an ecstatic, communal form of dancing and singing, were not just entertainment. They were tools of survival. Rhythms became rituals. Songs became shields. The sorrow songs, as E.B. Du Bois would later call them, contained the soul of a sorrowful race but also its hope. These were the earliest roots of blues, gospel, jazz. From the fields came the sounds that would one day echo in every corner of American music. Their food, too, told us: okra, rice, dried peas, Ben seeds. Ingredients from West Africa took root in the American South, adapted through necessity and ingenuity. From this fusion came gumbo, hoppin' John, red rice dishes born of memory and made with the kind of care that no overseer could measure. Every meal cooked over open flame or in cast iron pots was a gesture of preservation, a reclaiming of dignity over daily sustenance. And then there were the healers, the conjure women and root workers. Drawing on African herbal medicine, they knew which roots cured fever, which leaves soothed burns, which brews protected the spirit. They treated wounds when white doctors would not. They delivered babies, blessed homes, and offered protection through talismans and rituals. Sometimes feared, sometimes revered, they stood at the intersection of body and soul, preserving ancient knowledge that generations had tried to bury. In the face of unimaginable lost language, freedom, family, the enslaved did something miraculous. They made culture, not from comfort, but from defiance. And what they created outlasted the system that tried to erase them. Today, the Gullah Geechee culture still breathes along the coastlines of the South, in the cadence of spoken words, in the steps of the ring shout, in the call of the conch shell at community gatherings. It is a reminder that the African presence in America was never just about labor. It was about life, complex, dignified, creative. So when we talk about the legacy of slavery, we must talk about what survived, the songs that slipped past the watchful eyes of overseers, the prayers whispered in two tongues, the stories that sailed across the Atlantic and landed in Carolina soil. We must talk about how enslaved people, denied everything, still made something enduring and beautiful. Their culture was more than survival, it was a reclamation, a way of saying, you can chain our bodies, but not our minds. You can split our families, but not our faith. You can rewrite the laws, but not the memory. And through that memory, through that music, through every pot of gumbo and every drumbeat under moonlight, they are still speaking. They are still here. They did not just want the labor, they wanted the mind. Slavery in America was not only a system of physical domination, it was a vast machine of psychological control, designed to crush the spirit before it even had a chance to rebel. The body could be shackled easily, but the will, that took something more calculated, more insidious. And so, across the plantations of the American South, control was exercised not only with whips and chains, but with twisted theology. Stolen children, iron collars, and fear that seeped deep into the soul. Religion, the very tool that for many would later offer hope and liberation, was first used as a weapon. Enslavers discovered early that Scripture could serve as a chain more binding than iron. Select passages: Ephesians 6:5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, were read aloud, emphasized, repeated in sermons designed not to save souls but to subjugate them. Enslaved people were taught that resistance was not just rebellion against the planter, it was rebellion against God. And in that distorted gospel, obedience was holiness, silence was virtue, and suffering was divine. White preachers were often sent into the quarters with one mission: to pacify. They preached a heaven that could only be reached through submission, and a hell reserved for the disobedient. These were not churches, they were ideological prisons. And yet, within these very spaces, enslaved people would later reclaim the Bible, find different verses, speak of Moses and the Exodus, and use faith to resist rather than obey. But in the beginning, religion was forged into chains. Equally powerful and more immediate was the trauma of family separation. Enslaved people lived under the constant threat that their loved ones could be sold at a moment's notice. A mother could be forced to watch her son dragged away in chains. A husband might vanish overnight, sold to another state, another plantation, never to be seen again. Children were bartered like livestock. Wives were auctioned as breeders. Love itself became dangerous, because any bond could be severed for profit. This was not random cruelty, it was deliberate. By breaking families apart, enslavers weakened the social fabric that could inspire resistance. A person with no family was easier to control. A man mourning his wife was less likely to run. A mother desperate to protect her child might do anything asked of her. This was not just economic, it was psychological warfare. Control through heartbreak. To enforce this fragile, fear-based system, violence was always close at hand. Iron collars spiked, weighted, unyielding, were clamped around the necks of runaways or troublemakers. Some had bells or hooks, making escape or even sleep unbearable. They were not simply restraints, they were public warnings. A grotesque form of humiliation worn like a brand. These collars screamed. This one disobeyed. And then came the patrols, formed in South Carolina as early as the early 18th century. Slave patrols became institutionalized across the South. These were armed white men, often poor and eager for authority, who roamed the countryside hunting for runaways, breaking up gatherings, enforcing curfews, and administering violence as they saw fit. They had the legal right to interrogate any black person free or enslaved, and the power to detain, beat, or kill them. The patrols were not just law enforcement. They were the enforcers of terror, the nightly reminder that freedom was not even a dream. The enslaved lived under a constant web of surveillance, where every step, word, and glance could be monitored. On many plantations, enslaved people were discouraged or outright forbidden from learning to read or write. Literacy was feared, because knowledge was power. A literate slave could read abolitionist newspapers, write a pass to escape, or communicate across distance. Books were denied, and curiosity was punished. To think independently was, in itself, an act of rebellion. But perhaps the most sinister tool of psychological control was internalized fear. After years of brutality, many enslaved people were conditioned to anticipate pain, betrayal, or loss. This kind of fear did not need chains, it lived in the bones. It told them not to hope. It told them not to dream. And yet, despite it all, many still did. Some enslaved people created covert systems of communication, whispers in the night, symbols drawn in dust, songs that carried double meanings. Others escaped not only through flight, but through storytelling, music, and faith reclaimed. They carved out spaces of joy and laughter, however fleeting, and in doing so preserved the humanity that the system tried to strip away. We often imagine slavery as a brutal physical system, and it was, but its deepest cruelty was the attempt to unmake the human spirit. The iron collar could be removed. The family could be reunited in memory or in heaven. But the war for the mind, that was the battle fought every single day. Today, when we remember slavery, we must also remember this invisible battlefield. We must understand that domination did not always shout. Sometimes, it whispered. It whispered through stolen prayers, rewritten scriptures, and crying children held one last time. It whispered through empty cradles and silent evenings where names were no longer spoken, because they hurt too much to say aloud. Yet, the system never fully won. Even under the crushing weight of its machinery, enslaved people found ways to remember, to teach, to sing. They passed on names, hid hope in lullabies, and reclaimed verses once used against them. Every spiritual sung in code, every tale of Brer Rabbit, every child taught to remember their African name, those were victories. however small. Slavery ended, but the scars of its psychological warfare linger. They linger in the way family trauma is inherited, in the suspicion bred by centuries of betrayal, in the quiet grief passed down through generations. But so too does the strength to endure, to believe, to rebuild. Because despite every effort to break the mind, to fracture the soul, to turn people into property, the enslaved remained, above all else, human. And in that humanity, they found the power to resist, to remember, and to rise. When the U.S. Congress officially banned the international slave trade in 1808, many hoped it would mark the beginning of the end for slavery in America. No longer could ships packed with kidnapped Africans legally dock in Charleston, Savannah, or New Orleans. But this legal milestone was, in many, a mirage, a half-truth that concealed a darker evolution of the institution. Slavery did not vanish. It metastasized, and from its new center, it spread inward, deeper into the heart of the young nation. What followed was one of the largest forced migrations in American history, the internal slave trade. Imagine this. A teenage boy wakes up in Virginia, where his family has lived for generations. He labors in the fields beside his parents, his siblings, his kin. But one morning, he is shackled without warning, sold to a trader, and marched westward hundreds of miles away from everything he is ever known. His family never sees him again. His name disappears from their mouths like smoke. This was not an isolated tragedy, it was a national system. With the Atlantic slave trade outlawed, the upper South states like Virginia and Maryland turned inward for profit. These older regions had excess enslaved laborers as their tobacco-based economies declined, while the cotton frontier in the deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana was booming. The solution: sell surplus enslaved people down the river to the cotton-hungry lands of the deep South. Families became currency. Children became investments. The enslaved body became more profitable than ever, not for its labor alone, but as a commodity to be bought, bred, and sold. Slave traders filled the vacuum left by the transatlantic ships. They operated like cold-blooded logistics firms, transporting human beings in coffles, long lines of chained men, women, and children forced to walk for weeks. Others were packed into wagons or shoved onto steamboats that snaked along the Mississippi River. Along these routes, infamous markets thrived: Natchez, New Orleans, Memphis, and the notorious forks of the road in Mississippi. Each stop was a place of sorrow, a stage for public auctions, humiliation, and permanent separation. Washington, see, the capital of the so-called free world, became a hub for this grim business. Pens holding enslaved people sat just blocks from the Capitol building. Charles Dickens, during his visit to America in 1842, expressed horror at the sight of families penned like livestock within sight of liberty's highest institutions. The irony was not lost on foreign observers, and it should not be lost on us now. This domestic trade did not just sustain slavery, it supercharged it. Between 1808 and the Civil War, nearly 1 million enslaved people were forcibly relocated within the United States. It was not migration in the traditional sense. These were not travelers seeking opportunity. They were captives, torn from one place and transplanted to another under duress, pain, and terror. Their footsteps formed trails that scarred the landscape, from Virginia tobacco fields to Louisiana sugar plantations, from Maryland farms to Mississippi cotton rows. And the psychological toll, it was immeasurable. The internal slave trade shattered not just families, but identities. When you lose your mother, your brother, your name, your language, your story, what remains of you? This systematic upheaval made it harder for enslaved people to maintain kinship networks, to preserve cultural memory, or to find emotional refuge. It was disruption by design. Yet, within this machinery of human trafficking, stories of resilience still emerge. Enslaved people memorized names, passed down fragments of songs, carried family stories across state lines like sacred heirlooms. In the darkness of slave pens and auction houses, they whispered hope to each other. Some escaped. Some fought back. Some simply endured, which, in itself, was an act of resistance. Economically, the internal slave trade became a cornerstone of Southern wealth. Planters in the Deep South grew rich off cotton, and the Upper South profited by supplying the bodies needed to grow it. Entire towns sprung up to support this commerce. Banks issued loans against the value of enslaved people. Insurance companies offered policies on their lives. Newspapers printed ads for auctions alongside church announcements. The entire infrastructure of American capitalism, from real estate to finance, was entangled in this internal trade. And this was no secret. Everyone knew. Children were taught to look away when the coffles passed. But they knew. Politicians made fortunes while preaching liberty. Clergy offered blessings at slave markets. Northern industries, textile mills, shipping companies profited from the products born of Southern bondage. It was a national complicity. The internal slave trade also gave birth to new mechanisms of control. In the Deep South, where enslaved populations outnumbered whites in many counties, harsher laws were enacted. Whippings increased. Rebellion was feared. Patrols intensified. Plantation hierarchies grew more rigid, more brutal. And yet, even here, in the deepest belly of the beast, enslaved people carved out moments of humanity, sharing meals, telling stories, birthing children, and singing songs that carried coded messages of hope and freedom. What does this chapter of history tell us? It tells us that slavery did not simply exist in America. It adapted, expanded, and embedded itself into every facet of life. It tells us that freedom, for many, was not lost once, but over and over again, as family ties were severed and resevered by an economy built on human flesh. And perhaps most importantly, it tells us that every footstep along those forced migration routes was a monument to survival, a monument to pain, a monument to a history that we must continue to excavate, not for guilt, but for understanding, not to reopen wounds, but to recognize them, and to say, finally, that the people who walked those roads were not forgotten. They were more than property. They were fathers, daughters, lovers, dreamers. They were Americans, and their journey, though forced and brutal, reshaped the nation's soil, spirit, and soul. In the quiet rustle of cotton fields, in the faded ink of plantation ledgers, and in the distant echo of spirituals sung under moonlight, the legacy of America's breeding farms and slave plantations refuses to die. It lives on, not as a ghost that haunts the past, but as a truth that demands to be remembered in the present. The bodies that labored, the children that were torn away, the women who endured unspeakable trauma, and the millions who walked shackled roads across the South, they did not vanish into history. Their pain became part of the soil. Their strength, part of our national due. Look around and you will see this legacy stitched into American life. It lingers in the deep inequalities of wealth, housing, and education. It echoes in the disparities in healthcare, incarceration, and political power. The same systems that once profited from selling human beings now manifest in modern structures that still divide, still wound, still weigh heaviest on the descendants of the enslaved. But this is not only a legacy of pain, it is also one of resilience, culture, and creativity. The Gullah Geechee people, the spirituals passed down through generations, The coded quilts, the tales of Brer Rabbit and Anansi, these are not relics. They are living testimonies to the human spirit's refusal to break. African American art, music, literature, and political movements all carry the fingerprints of those who were once deemed less than human. They are the children of survival, and through them, the enslaved continue to speak. In the 20th century, as the civil rights movement surged, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. invoked the memory of slavery not to dwell in sorrow, but to mobilize for justice. They knew that America could never be truly free until it confronted its oldest sins. The marches, the sit-ins, the speeches, they were new verses in the long song of resistance that began in the slave quarters and the cotton fields. That same song continues today in the movements for racial justice, reparations, and historical truth. Art has become one of the most powerful mediums through which the legacy of slavery is both remembered and reimagined. Kara Walker's silhouette installations force us to confront the grotesque intimacy of plantation life. Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad blends magical realism with historical pain to reassert the humanity of the enslaved. Films like 12 Years a Slave and documentaries like The 13th challenge audiences to look again, more honestly, at the American story. But reckoning is not just happening in galleries and on screens. Across the South, people are uncovering hidden family histories, diaries, letters, and oral traditions once kept quiet out of shame or fear are now being brought into the light. Museums like the Whitney Plantation and the National Museum of African American History and Culture are shifting the narrative, placing the enslaved at the center of the story instead of the margins. Even universities and corporations are beginning to acknowledge how much of their foundations were built on the backs of enslaved labor. Yet, the work is far from done. Statues may fall, but systems take longer to dismantle. Names may be remembered, but justice requires more than memory, it demands action. We must continue to ask hard questions. How do we teach this history in our schools? How do we honor the lives that were stolen? How do we ensure that the next generation understands not just what happened, but why it still matters? Because it does still matter. When we talk about Lumpkin's Jail, we are not just talking about one building in Richmond. We are talking about the machinery of dehumanization. When we talk about Ely Whitney's cotton gin, we are not just talking about a machine, we are talking about how profit fueled cruelty. When we remember the internal slave trade, we are remembering the millions who walked in chains across a country that promised liberty for all. And when we tell the stories of resistance, of encoded songs, of midnight escapes, of quiet defiance and bold rebellion, we are affirming a truth often forgotten. The enslaved were never passive victims. They were survivors, innovators, and rebels. They built America not just with their hands, but with their minds, hearts, and hope. So if this story moved you, if it made you think differently about history, about humanity, about the cost of what we call progress, do not let it end here. Share this video. Like it. Comment. Send it to someone who needs to hear this story. Because silence is how history gets erased. But when we speak, when we remember together, we create space for healing and for change. This is not just Black history. This is American history, and understanding it fully is the only way we can build a future worthy of those who endured the unimaginable. Thank you for walking this journey with us. Let their names be known, let their stories be told, and let this channel be a place where truth lives, where history is honored, and where silence is never allowed to win.